Can't remember which one it is. Cool.
How do you like the
How about that one?
We're just because we're trying to get him on the video here, so he's not.
Well, if no one joins,
Well,
can people join anonymously?
they can watch it later too.
Oh, this is recording right
Yeah,
now? I've just been like embarrassing myself forever.
You know that you can plug into our camera there if you want to.
No, it's cool. How do I do that?
Let's see. There's a cable.
Is it this?
Alright, that's not so bad for lighting.
HDMI. Where are you?
I'm just trying to. Does it look pretty scary?
I think probably because I'll share my screen the entire time.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah,
We're just
okay.
gonna.
I can't remember which one it is. It's somewhere.
We're live.
Okay. All right, hey everybody. I'm Kyle Buchanan. I'm one of the organizers here for Triangle JavaScript, and we're so glad everybody's here. It's a big crowd, and I'm sorry I look ridiculous for trying to record this. If I put this down, we'll get it turned off once we get going here. But so I'm working on a presentation for next month it's another Internet of Things presentation. The last one with Burr was great. It was he covered a ton of stuff. This next one's going to be a little bit more focused. So I'm trying to nail down a location and a date, but expect something about the Internet of Things in November. And I think this is kind of what we've done for the last 2 years, is that we don't really do anything in December because of the holidays. Yeah, we're talking about the holidays already. So I think probably November will be the last one for the year, and then we'll just pick up in January again. So do you want to say something real quick about
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Pat Dillon. I'm from here at Bronto. Welcome. We develop a leading marketing automation platform primarily used by online retailers. We scale like crazy. We send millions of messages every day. We're growing, and of course, since we're growing, we are hiring. So if front-end is your cup of tea, which I imagine for most of you, that is the case. We work with things like Backbone, React, a little bit of Angular, experimental JavaScript, ES6 2015, or whatever you want to call it right now. And if you are not exactly a front-end developer, front-end is just a small slice of what we do here. We have positions open across the board for developers, so check out careers.bronto.com. And thanks again.
Thank you again for hosting us. I love coming here. This place is great. The pizza was awesome. Free beer. You can't really get a better host for a meetup than Bronto. So announcements. Who went to All Things Open the last 2 days? Wow, good number of you guys. I see a couple T-shirts around here. How was it? Yeah. It's got to be like the best value for a conference that you can get, because it's not that expensive, plus it's local. I mean, pretty much every other conference you go to, you have to travel to get to. So did anyone attend any interesting talks or anything in particular that they took away from the conference? Don't all raise your hands. Well, I'll say one of my coworkers, he went and listened to, does he go by Christian or is it Christian Heilman from Microsoft? Christian. Great ammo. If your company is still supporting Internet Explorer 8 and 9, he gave a really good talk on why you shouldn't do that and why Microsoft is telling you to stop supporting. So there's even a Microsoft white paper that you can use at your company to tell all of your executives, let's stop doing this. So does anybody have any jobs that they are looking to fill, or anybody looking for a job?
Python, JavaScript, no previous experience, ready to break in.
Okay, and were you you, I think, got here early and got, okay, all right. I'm glad you're here. Glad you found it. Up top.
I'm Ed Bulworth, president of Little Green Software. We've been looking at React Native and looking forward to seeing what you guys been exploring too. And we're hiring a full stack dev and mobile developers.
Cool.
So we lost it late. I'm not trying to set that impression, but we all work at Willow Tree Apps. We're relative newcomers in this area, but we're hiring JavaScript developers. We do a lot of client work with React, and we've been exploring React Native as an option because we do Android and iOS native development as well.
There's a group of us here from the Iron Yard. We're students that are graduating on demo day November 20th. We'll all be looking for jobs.
All right.
Come find us here. We want to work for you.
You guys having like a showcase event or?
Yeah, November 20th is demo day.
November 20th. Where? When?
Skybox. Yeah, it's at Skybox.
Okay, cool.
You can contact Dana at the Iron Yard for more information.
Or maybe one of you guys could put a link in the comments for today's meetup. That would also work. See how this whole meetup thing works?
Hey, there's a group of us here from Smashing Boxes, and we are a dev shop. We do front and back end. So mostly Angular, a little React, Ruby back end, and Android and iOS. And we're hiring for all of those positions. So if any of this vacancy, come talk to me or one of these guys.
And you guys are like right
We're like right across the street.
Right
We're
there,
across
yeah.
the street, which is the benefit.
Anybody else? Okay, cool. So I think, are you ready? Oh, and I've got one T-shirt to give away at the end, so hang tight. You get to see the cool Triangle JavaScript raffle application.
I started out making one of them. Got complicated.
You were making a raffle thing
Yeah.
for this?
Not for this.
Oh.
Well, yeah, for this, but,
Okay.
but then it got complicated. Okay, so it's,
Just wanna share.
yeah, let's drag this over. Click play. I think that'll work.
Oh, it's on.
Cool. Okay, so here's other interesting thing too. So we're screencasting. This is complicated now. So let's share my screen.
Just the button.
I see it now.
I feel old.
Are we good on
Yeah, I
that?
see it.
Awesome. Cool.
Where's the button on this?
Oh, there. This is on the back.
How did you do that?
Oh, it's got a power button on the back.
Oh.
That's what happens when your phone is the size of an iPad. There's a lot of places to put buttons, I guess. Hey everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Nate, and I am here to talk to you about React Native. So yeah, I'm Nate Hunziker. I'm a front-end developer at Viget. We're a digital agency based out of Falls Church, but we also have offices in Durham and in Boulder, Colorado. And we do some really cool stuff. I have the opportunity to work with some amazing people doing brilliant things like mobile web apps, fantastic page transitions that help you really quickly identify, a vacant room, book it, get on with your life. That's not so exciting to me. I guess I just really love the work that Dan did on this project. Some other things too, like games for kids. This is Pablo Python, a game where we teach kids about animals, and it's not doing anything. That's okay. And pretty cool stuff. And we also do a lot in the web with data visualization, really pushing performance as much as we can to get every ounce of power out of the browser that we can, building particle engines, which may not come together so well on the screen, but lots of particles, lots of fun. So yeah, we love web apps. I love web apps. I think there's a lot of really awesome things about them. They're easy to ship. It's really easy just to say, like, release, run my build, sync it up with an S3 bucket, get a deploy out in like 10 seconds. That's really, really powerful and great when you're working with a team, cross office, particularly like a designer in Boulder or something like that. I can really quickly make a change, fix a problem, push it up, and get feedback right away. And that feedback loop extends not just to deployment, but to the development process as well. There we go. You know, we have really awesome tools for web apps now. We can do live reload for style sheets. We can do hot code swapping using tools like Webpack to dynamically update the browser right away. That's the wrong one. That probably makes a lot more sense in a second. Okay, cool. There we go. I think there's a little bit of a skip between the slides. That's okay. So yeah, so client generation, talked about this in the last JavaScript meetup. Modern build tools allow us to do a lot in the browser to update code as changes happen. So we don't have to refresh the browser even anymore. So when we're building complicated web applications, we don't have to always worry about reproducing state. We don't have to be in that horrible situation where you're making a ton of edits in the Elements panel of Chrome or Firefox, and then make sure you sync up all those updates with your style sheet afterward, or all those JavaScript changes. And I really like JavaScript. You know, maybe I have Stockholm syndrome, but JavaScript's an awesome language, particularly ES6 JavaScript, or 2015, 2016 JavaScript. Really cool language, and it's a lot of fun to work with. But at the end of the day, you know, web apps aren't everything. Native apps exist, they're really popular, and they do a lot of really great things. Particularly, they get user experience right in a really, really good way. User experience on native apps is more consistent with the platform, it's faster, they're allowed to do things, not allowed to necessarily, but they can do things with lower level access to resources that we can't in the browser, or that we had to try very hard to do on our own. And native apps have first-class touch support. You know, we can make pinch zoom rotation stuff in the browser, but you can do really complicated touch interactions in native apps that are really hard to do otherwise in web apps without loading a lot of code and doing a ton of QA. And finally, I think this is the big nail in the coffin. Is like, what if your project needs Bluetooth access, or you know, what if you just really need low-level access to hardware, like file storage or access to an SQLite database? You can do these things in web apps, but it's an answered problem that native apps just take for granted. So I was pleased to hear about the announcement of React Native at React Conference 2015. I remember Chris is here. All of the front-end developers at the Viget office, we like wrote down the company credit card information on cards and like all typed it in as fast as we could to get tickets, and like they were gone before any of us could finish like the information. My friend still gloats that he like called, he like did the form on his phone, and he had his like wife pull off the road on the highway to submit the thing, and he got a ticket. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's Frontier Internet, I don't know. But so yeah, that's why I'm here. Sorry to get off on that tangent. But you know, what is React Native? That's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about it at a high level, go through some simple code examples, and then talk a little bit about where it fits in with the other offerings that exist currently. Okay, I see now. So React Native is a framework for using React to render native applications. The idea behind React Native is that instead of rendering to the DOM that React does, React Native is a version of React that uses the native platform to render native UI for you. So you're not writing to a browser, you're actually writing native user interface code. And so for those unfamiliar, I did want to go ahead and just run through React really quickly. I didn't know if the entire audience would be well versed with it or not. So I wanted to talk through some of the high level concepts behind React. So this is a React component. There's a couple of things going on here. React components created by React.create class are sort of like the atomic unit of user interface in React. A React app is comprised of a collection of components that have child components and so on and so forth. Each component needs to have a render method, and this render method tells React what your user interface should look like. And it uses a special syntax here that looks very similar to HTML. It's called JSX. And so JSX is a pre-processed language that compiles down into low-level instructions, low-level, still JavaScript, but low-level instructions to React for how to build user interface. So you write code that looks very similar to HTML for your render functions. And then whenever you compile your JavaScript using a tool such as Babel, it converts that code into a bunch of instances of React.create element all over the place. And that's really cool because what you end up being able to do is create your own DSL or domain-specific language for the environment that you're working in. So say you have a chart, you can abstract that chart into the chart container, and then say you want to show a trend line and a scatter plot for the same data set. Break that down into a trend line component and a trend line scatter plot and send that data set into both of them. If you want to add more than one trend line, put 2 trend lines in there. The whole idea is that you're building this component tree where parents send down data to children in a tree-like data structure. So that data flows in a consistent direction from parents to children. So what that means is that whenever data changes in your app, a parent at the top level receives it. It sends that information down to its children. And you can make decisions along the way, like, well, I don't care about this data. I really only care about this one specific piece of information. And you can very quickly cull entire parts of your render tree to make very performant rendering for your application. And beyond that, what React is doing for us is it's creating an abstraction over the DOM, allowing us to write user interfaces in a declarative way, sort of similarly to what we did doing server-side rendering with HTML, where you can look at a file and you know what the ideal state should be. React is trying to bring us back to that, coming from direct manipulation using jQuery and other mechanisms. And it's abstracting away browser inconsistencies as well. So a lot of the value that React brings over a lot of other projects that are doing similar things is the dedication that it puts into dealing with all the different annoying browser issues between Safari, and Internet Explorer, and Firefox, and Chrome. And I thought I'd do a little quick demo, just real quick, to demonstrate that. So let's go to the browser. There we go. Oh, you can barely see that. Okay. We'll zoom in. So this is a little drawing app I made. Basically, we keep track of clicks to the screen. So click, make a pixel, pixel, pixel. Do it a couple times. And each time we make a click, we're keeping track of that individual click happening on a particular part of the screen. And so what happens then is React is just adding up all of those, or not React itself, but our JavaScript app is adding up all of those individual clicks, creating a picture out of it. So what's so cool about this is that in our code, we're just rendering, we're telling it to render the ideal state. So I can just keep clicking and keep updating the same matrix of values, and it renders the exact same component tree every single time with minor differences. And then React figures out how to render that for me. So if I want to do something silly like, go back to before I made that frown, that smiley face, and let's say I'm actually really sad, we can create that. Wow, I can't click, can I? We can create that frown, right? Let's say we change our mind. We can switch back. Happy, sad, happy. And so, the undo state of this is not inherently a property that React gives you, but it's one that React makes much simpler because we can think about data as changes in time. That state is the result of adding up these changes over time and getting a final state based on everything that's happened. And then we just have to send that state into React and it'll render it. It doesn't care. What React is enabling us to do is not worry about the changes between states, just to express the ideal state. So we can do really neat things like undo for drawing very cheaply. Come on. Oh, right. It's funny. Okay. So hard to see. I have to bring this over. Sorry, guys. Maybe I won't. There we go. Okay. Okay, now I can see. Okay, we'll make that way bigger. Okay, so this is what we've got going on here. So we've got two components at the at the start. We've got the canvas that we're working to, and we've got this undo tree. So this is actually really cool too. I can use the undo tree to change the ideal state for my drawing, but then React is rendering the ideal state for the history. So kind of cool. We've got a canvas, right, and an undo tree. We've got some pixel data, and we send that pixel data down into the canvas and into the undo tree. So if I go into the undo tree, we've got a little bit of DOM going on here. I'm calling the tree rendering library for Paths.js, which is a fantastic tool for getting just the calculations for doing SVG visualization. We create our SVG block at a given size, and we rinse and repeat the same process. We've broken down our history into the nodes, which are like the individual dots, and the edges, the things that are connecting them. And so this just more or less closely matches the data that we get back from the tree. And it just keeps going all the way down. So if we want to look at the edges, we go to the edges component. And one of the neat things about React with JSX is that we do have access to JavaScript instead of the templates. So in this case, I'm taking an items array and I'm mapping over it and getting a path for each curve in my history. And so that's sort of the high level, I guess, idea behind React, or one of them at any rate, is that we've got these components that have properties. We break down complex components into smaller components when we need to, and we let composition be the primary organizational unit for our app. Click play, come on. Okay. So then we've looked at that. You came to this talk to look at React Native. So with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about that. So again, instead of providing a UI abstraction from the browser, what React Native is doing is more or less the same thing for iOS and Android currently. And this is a trend that React is going to. Actually, in React 0.14, they completely isolated away the core of React with the DOM renderer. So whenever you write React code now, you import the React DOM module as a separate piece. And this is really, really cool because it's opened up a whole community of people writing rendering engines. I don't have it included here. I really should. But someone wrote a rendering engine for Blest Contrib. So you can write terminal apps using React, which is pretty cool. Someone wrote a WebGL rendering tool, and Flipboard made a React canvas that operates in a very similar way. So there's a lot of really cool things going on in the community, and React has really shift focused since React Native is picked up to being more of a general tool for authoring like applications, or more of a general tool for abstracting away the building of user interfaces into components in a declarative way, not necessarily just for the browser. So instead of having, a React class for, this is an email that we saw before, instead of our components being list tags, H3s, paragraph tags, in React Native, we've got a view, just sort of like a box. We've got a switch for checkboxes that I'll get into later, an image tag, text tag. It's more or less the same thing. I mean, there's a little bit different going on because the browser's fundamentally a different environment. But the authoring experience is more or less the same. You've got components. You break up complexity by making more components to manage all the individual concerns for your user interfaces. And more than that, the whole thing takes advantage of these really awesome, fast JavaScript engines that we have packaged in our mobile platforms. What React Native is doing for you is it's providing a bridge between a JavaScript thread executing all of your application code and a separate process that's rendering the UI. So this is something that I wish we could do in the browser now, because it would solve so many issues with performance, animating things. Because you can execute all of your JavaScript code and it doesn't block rendering of the UI, and vice versa. So you get really, really smooth UIs using it in this way. And beyond that, it's taking sort of a different stance to technologies such as Cordova. And I really like Cordova a lot, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later. But Cordova's philosophy is sort of write once, publish anywhere. So write a web app, not necessarily a web app, but write an app using web technologies and make minor tweaks maybe for different platforms, but pretty much publish the same code base everywhere. Share a lot of code. At least that's how I've been using it, and how I have a background in using it. And that's really successful. You can be really successful doing that. But React Native is taking a very different approach. So their approach is, let's give you a consistent authoring model. Let's teach you React. And once you learn the very simple mechanisms inside of React, learn how to use it to write things in a bunch of different environments. In terminals, on the server, on Node, rendering strings. In the browser, on the Android, on iOS. Their take on this, and the take I'm starting to feel more and more as things like Material Design are coming out, and even just with the change from skeuomorphism to flat design in iOS, is that these platforms have very different user experiences. And it's just really hard to write once and publish everywhere whenever the user experience for all of these platforms is very different. So enough talk. Let's do a basic example of React Native, walk through a little bit of it. I'll keep it pretty simple, just use the introductory app on React Native's website. So if you want to go home later and try this out, you can, and you've seen all this before. And then we'll get into some more involved stuff later. Oh, come on, you can do it. Oh, it's because I'm full screen. I get a bunch of comments in Meetup about how I can't manage displays. see what I want to do. That's what I want to do. Perfect. Okay. So we'll start with the first demo. This is a React Native project. So you can see quickly they've already broken down into the various platforms. You have an Android folder, which is including project-specific things for running your Android project. Similarly for iOS. And then there's also one more thing here. So Node modules, that's pulling in all of your Node dependencies. React Native uses NPM, and so you can just download something from NPM, save it to your package.json, and there's you hit the same things you hit whenever you're doing isomorphic or universal JavaScript stuff. Like you can't pull in some library that's accessing the window because it's going to break in the browser, stuff like that. But you can use all the really fantastic packages on NPM that do operate just in a very standard JavaScript environment. We have separate entry points. So there is a dedicated entry point for Android, and there is a dedicated entry point for iOS. So if we'll open up the iOS one here. I'm going to open this up in Xcode. Go ahead and close out. Bye, guy. Okay, and I will zoom in for you guys. We'll do an iPhone 6S for screen real estate reasons, and we'll run it, and it's going to build. And so there's a couple of things going on. React Native is booting up the JavaScript end of this. Whenever you first start up a project, it installs a bunch of dependencies and builds the app for you. Let's see if we can get my emulator open. And I've got a compile error, so we'll look at that. So the error I'm getting here isn't one that I'm expecting, but we'll go ahead and walk through it anyway. Basically, the application hasn't been registered with iOS, the rendering engine. So tell you what we'll do. This is a bit of a cop-out, but I'm gonna open up the next one. Okay, you guys are getting a sneak peek. Sorry about this, but so this is the app. This is the next demo app. Basically, it runs, right? So it's native code. We've got native checkboxes. This is using the Navigator iOS component that I'll go into later. And this is just pinging the meetup.com API and getting all the people RSVP'd to this talk. So a couple of interesting things going on here. One is that we can see I have we're getting the UI thread running with the JavaScript thread running. They run in parallel. So whenever we make changes to JavaScript code, it's not executing on the UI thread. And we can pan around. And we're getting pretty good FPS. This is using the list view, which does automatically cleaning up and tearing down of list items, as they enter and leave the screen, so you get really good scroll performance. And then just real quick, fun stuff. There I am. So click, takes you to the next page. We get native page transitions, all sorts of things. You get really nice touches, right? Because this is native UI that a lot of people don't pick up on. Like I don't necessarily pick up on when I'm reproducing native UI in the browser. Like, just clicking back and forth. That's okay. But what a lot of people, like I didn't pick up for a long time because I'm not an iOS device user, is like when you hold down on it, the button expands ever so slightly, and it moves, and the shadow moves back and forth perfectly. And these are touches that are really hard to reproduce in CSS, or things that you have to do on your own. And this is bypassing it, and it's just saying, let's just render the native UI anyway. see, a couple more things. There's a neat panel. So if you push Command D, it's going to pull up. You can debug JavaScript debugging in Chrome or Safari. I have live reload enabled. We'll get into that in a minute. But basically, whenever you make changes, it'll recompile the JavaScript, so you don't have to do a build step every single time you make a change, which is really cool. And I think getting back to talking about having really fast feedback loops in web development, this is something that you get with React Native that's great. Is sort of the bringing over the fast, rapid feedback loop developer tools for JavaScript inside of native application development. If I want to recompile my app, I push Command R, and I get an app again, just like the browser. We can go through some of that. We'll go through some of that code too. So, oh, hopefully my young eyes will aid me here. Okay. iOS.js. Okay, so this is my main entry point. I'm basically just pulling in the index page for my app, and I'm pulling in the app registry that's a part of React Native that tells it, to register this app with the iOS application. Registering that component, and this is what tells it to render it to the screen. If I dig deeper into the index, we'll go to source/index. Pulling in React components. I've got this Navigator iOS that I'll talk about later for doing navigation between pages. But this looks really similar to the previous demo. This is a JavaScript app. This is a React component. If it weren't for like iOS, you could mistake this for a JavaScript component that ran in the browser really easily. If we we'll go to the show page. See, we're pulling in the text view, the text and the view components from React Native. So these are components that React Native is giving you out of the box. So this is different than traditional React, where you just get, the React standard library. You're getting a whole set of already made components for that render native UI. But we have text, we have a view, we have images, we have things like that. There's a whole list of them documented in the React Native website. And so this is showing an individual page. I give it a person prop, and I get the title out of it, and I say, so-and-so is great for attending my talk. So shameless, I guess. But there is one thing there that's pretty interesting, which is the style tag here, right? So this is using inline styles. For those of you familiar with the React code, this is how you declare inline styles whenever you're targeting the DOM for React. So we've told it flex 1 using flexbox, padding 50, margin top 40. This brings me back to my slides. Yeah, this brings back to the styling. So, you've got to style your application. This is how you do styling in React Native. That's not great on its own, I'll admit. And inline styling, I don't know if you follow anyone on React, there's this mob of people that are out to burn React for mandating inline styles, or thinking that inline styles might be a really cool idea. Inline styles can be a really cool idea because particularly in React Native, where you don't have this notion of class names and IDs and things like that. You have props, right? And they're not really quite inline styles. To me, this isn't so far off from having a helper object that contains class names for states for a component. And if you replace style here with class, and you replace styles.continue with the string, you pretty much got it. You don't have a class in CSS with a cascade and with the ability to manipulate children. But you do get something else that's really cool, which is JavaScript for style information, which means you can operate on your styles as if they were JavaScript objects. If you've got some sort of interesting calculation you need to run for information that you're getting, so you have a data visualization or something like that, you can use JavaScript to calculate all those values. Say you know the image dimensions for an image and you want to do a specific calculation so it aligns perfectly. This is how you do it, right? And so there's a couple other things going on here too. So I'm referencing here align items, flex direction, justify content. And this is because React Native uses Flexbox as its layout model. So whenever they were looking at all of the potential platforms they wanted to support, and there are a couple of other reasons too that one of the core contributors to React talks about in his conference talk at React 2015. But when you look at them, Flexbox is really a fantastic layout engine. And what they've decided to do is skip over things like Cassowary, the constraint-based algorithm for iOS, the layout algorithms for Android, and whatever else they might add. And they've created an implementation of CSS layout for Flexbox in JavaScript. And it's really fast and it's awesome. And you can use this generally. This is a general purpose tool. So let's get into demo 3. I already alluded to it quite a bit. Zoom in here. I hope this zoom in shows up on the camera. We'll see. Otherwise, people are going to be looking at it with a microscope, excuse me, microglass. Yeah, so we've got all the people who RSVP'd the talk. Everyone else who didn't, they don't have a checkbox here. You can see the list view with the scroll bar on the right is pulling in more results the further I go down as it's pulling in more data to render. If we click on, I'll click on me because I don't want to single anybody out, I guess. But if we click on me, we have this transition back and forth. And this is like using the expected transition between pages in iOS, which is really cool. So let's look at how that works. Okay, so I'm already there, sort of. Index. Okay, so to do this, I'm pulling in, this nav. Well, okay. So to do this, I'm pulling in Navigator iOS. So Navigator iOS is it's like a high-level component for iOS and React Native for doing navigation changes. There's a lower-level one that's more powerful called Navigator. But Navigator iOS gives you some really simple interactions for moving back and forth, sort of the push-pop, adding and removing views from a stack idea. And so the way that it works is that you give it an initial view to render, and it passes a Navigator prop to that view. And so the child view can then use that to say, okay, I want to now push another view into this view stack. And then it keeps track of all of that and maintains all the UI that you need to go back and forth and have the title bar that behaves as you expect, and so on and so forth. There's a couple other cool things there too, which that you can send props into it. So the way that we get access to the user information is that whenever we push the new view route into the Navigator, we also pass the person that we clicked on as a property. And then what that allows us to do is just access the person as if it were a prop. Just like what we looked at before with the general examples for React. The component itself doesn't realize necessarily that it's a route. It's just being used as one, and it knows that it needs a person to render. And that's all it really cares about. And it lets the parent handle all the logic or the responsibility of being in control of navigation. So. Sure. No worries. Cool. Okay. I guess so. While we wait, we'll talk a little bit more about. I'll talk about this later, but I'll go ahead and get into it now, which is sort of the caveats with this approach. So one of the things that I bumped into, and that a lot of people are bumping into with React Native, is that you have this bridge between the JavaScript thread and the UI thread. And so whenever you're doing complex interactions, you're going back and forth between the two a lot for animation and things like that. And so that is something where people have bumped into. Oh, that's interesting. but there have been people who have sort of bumped into performance issues with that. Sorry, everyone on the screencast. This probably looks really weird. Let's see, let's try just resetting. Let's see. Keynote. I wonder if it's just because I'm in Keynote. Maybe. Any ideas?
Are you maximizing Keynote right now?
Oh.
Yes, I got that.
Oh, there we go. Cool.
Got it.
Let's do I'll just try resetting this to the default for the display. Oh man. There we go. It was probably because I was zoomed in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Can I show my screen again? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about that, everyone. I think we're in good shape now. Thank you, everyone, for waiting. That was fun. Okay, we're back. All right. Cool. Yeah. So there is an interesting thing going on here that I hadn't talked about yet, which is a typo here, but a ref, and I'm not using it here, but buffers read only. No matter what. So actually, there must have been a typo there whenever I was fussing around with the screen. But basically, a ref is like it's a reference point to a piece of your React component. So I'm not using it here. Actually, this is just an artifact of the development process. It's a really kind way to put it. But basically, what a ref allows you to do is say, like, whenever an action happens, get a specific piece of a component and make a decision about it or do something about it. So it's really useful in the DOM for getting measurements for something if you're doing a complicated animation, or doing some other thing where you need access to the specific component itself. Let's go ahead and move on though. So the important thing here. The important thing here is that we've got a route. We're telling it what component to use. The people component. We give it a title. So this is how the title shows up at the top of the screen. And we pass that into the Navigator iOS component as the initial route. And then I just threw in some basic style there, basically just flex1, tell it to fill the container. So if we go into people, I've got this component here called render person. And so this function here called render person. So we go up to the top, we've got, I've got this loading state. So whenever I'm fetching information from the Meetup API, I show this loading state that says, I'm loading people. And then whenever I'm done, I go up to the top here, and in the render method, basically say the logic here is, if the state's loading, return the rendered loading view. Otherwise, use this list view component that comes with React Native for doing performant lists, like scrolling through tons of information. We tell it our data source. We tell it the function to run whenever it enumerates over the rows. And we give it some basic style information too. So what this is going to do is it's going to take a data source, and it's going to send the properties of that data source into the render row function. So if we go down to the bottom there, we can see it's calling this render person function. It's getting a person argument. And we use that person argument, we pull parameters out of it to render the person's image, a switch just for fun to show the native UI, and some text about that person too. And this is cool. And this is actually really similar to a new format for creating components in React 0.14, where you don't have to use the React.create class syntax. You can just specify a component if you don't need any access to any other methods inside of React. It's a simple function that takes properties as its first argument and returns what you see here, which is pretty nice. So if I wanted to, I could probably pull this out into just a person row component, and it would work out of the box, which is really neat. So I got this touchable highlight here that I just really quickly wrapped around this image. And on press, we get a callback. So I'm passing in an anonymous function, ES6 style, saying whenever this is pressed down, call this callback, which executes this dot on press person. We pass in that person. Since the people component was sent down through the Navigator iOS component, we got access to that Navigator property. So I'm just accessing it here and saying, get the Navigator prop out, pushing my new component, send some new properties down. And what that's going to do is that's going to push that view onto the stack for the Navigator, and it's going to render the new screen. As we see here, Nate is great. It's funny, I didn't want to single anybody out, and now I look like I'm full of myself. Yes, and so we get this really fantastic change back and forth. Something that I would have spent like half a day on maybe, or a couple of hours on, getting the interaction back and forth right. There's a couple of nuances here though that we don't see, which is like, the next page is overlapping over the previous page, and with an easing function that's very specific to iOS. These easing functions and these small touches really add up to making something feel like it's an authentic native experience, and things that are really hard to do in web-based tools. So it's really exciting for me to see. It's funny, like there's this framework for rendering native UI, and I'm more excited about the easing function moving back and forth between these pages. Okay. So with that out of the way, I sort of wanted to close up with some context around where I think React Native fits in with other tools like Titanium and Cordova. And so first one I want to talk about is Cordova. And I really like Cordova a lot. I was working on an app just a couple of weeks ago, and the client had a concern about limiting access to it and wanted to seriously, look at evaluating, could I ship this as a native app and send this over their enterprise distribution setup for iOS? And that was a really legit option for me to evaluate because I was working on a JavaScript app I just had to take my build directory, throw it into Cordova, evaluate it, and it just worked. And we seriously considered that option as one of the options for this client. That was a very specific use case, maybe a bit of a straw man. But Cordova is really powerful, and it's been around for a really long time. And it's a very mature platform at this point. Things that I really hope for in a year or so of React Native. They've got a really great plugin ecosystem, and they've really got a fantastic model for building things in this way. But when it comes down to it, like I showed in my demo, when React Native is rendering something to the screen, it's rendering native UI, and it's following the patterns of that platform. And native platforms have got a lot of really fantastic interactions going on. I'm particularly like with Android, like material design is awesome. And React Native isn't, from what I could tell, working through evaluating Android, it isn't quite there yet, but there's a lot of really interesting libraries in the community for React Native that are bringing material design to the Android platform for React Native. And this is really cool stuff, and it's really awesome because most of the time I really am only concerned about sharing all of my application logic. It's worth it to me if like platforms are so different and users are expecting such a difference between the platforms just to write different user interfaces for them. And so I really like that React Native is sort of following this model. That's just sort of my own personal decision. And again, like JavaScript and CSS are really awesome, but it's just really, really hard to reproduce all of this stuff. And that isn't something I want to be doing on my projects. I don't want to be spending my time, reproducing something else, like creating this expectation. I'd much rather be like I'm not interested in that problem, I guess, myself. I'm more interested in solving other problems, more problems that are more interesting to me on these projects besides recreating native UI. It's a lot getting ahead of myself, I guess, but it's just a lot of work. But on the other end of the spectrum, we do have tools that build native UI like Titanium. And I think that the best comparison I can make for Titanium without getting into some interesting things about their distribution model, and I know he's not here, but someone was telling me about how like he sees like a network request go out every time he compiles, and he always wonders, where's that network request going? NSA. Is that how they make all their money? Yeah. But I think the best case I can make, the one that doesn't end up like, maybe, but the one that doesn't throw you into a big flame war about one platform being better than the other is React Native is React. It's got that authoring model that I generally like. This idea of describing your ideal state for your user interface, worrying about the changes, not dealing with this imperative API, just building your user interface the way you expect it, and then just focusing on changing data and really treating those as separate problems. And it's a really great model. And it's really easy for me switching between projects to wonder if I know pretty much right away from the project or things like that. But whenever you get to a certain level of abstraction, the implementation detail of where you're rendering to goes away, and you stop thinking about it. And there's I think a lot of people talk about context changes between languages and things like that. That's the context change like I worry about, or that I like to avoid, and that I appreciate avoiding, is changing like authoring models, going from like React to jQuery to something else. Keeping that consistent. I don't know that there's a lot of productivity gains there, but I find it very compelling. And while we were waiting, and I was figuring out the jigsaw puzzle that was my screen, I talked about this a little bit, but there are some caveats, of course. They announced this in January. Android support's only been out for a couple months. This is a very, very young framework. And you are going to bump into things where you'll have to get on IRC or Google around and find something for some custom thing that you're doing in React Native that isn't in the docs. Some unsupported feature that you need to have on your project, like we were doing a React Native project, and we needed Bluetooth support for a specific device. I mean, we didn't have that out of the box, so we roll our own Objective-C code to do that. And that was fine, and that was an enjoyable problem. Using React Native solved a whole other host of problems that we didn't have to deal with. But it does highlight that there really is, it's not an excuse to learn a little bit of native code. You know, if you're deploying to these platforms, like know the platform itself. Don't hide behind JavaScript. Really dig in and put in the time to learn, you know, where you're actually building to. And like I mentioned before, the native component support is not comprehensive, and they are very transparent about this, particularly on Android. It's worth checking out sort of the known issues before evaluating React Native for your project, like with anything. See if like these issues will impact your project. These are going away, and React Native has really awesome, super active development. But it is something to think about if you're like going to think responsibly about choosing frameworks for your projects. But I do have some encouragement, because I'm not just going to in my presentation about why you shouldn't use it. The developer experience is fantastic. Completely unlike anything else I've done working with native apps. Whenever I get an error that I haven't included, like a component, like whenever I was building the demo example, I sort of subconsciously pulled in the touchable highlight component to the touch region, and I got an error that said, hey, this is undefined, but I know this namespace. Did you forget to include this from the React Native Standard Library? And that's really cool to see. And sure enough, I went up, imported it, refreshed my screen, didn't have to go through an entire compile step or anything. That's really, really cool. Working on styles for these apps, it's great to just save the style sheet, have it refresh for me right away. You know, before what I would do whenever I was debugging an issue on like Cordova apps, you know, like being the iOS inspector, I'd pull up Safari, use Safari to inspect into the DOM and tweak it a little bit, make a change, you know, go through the entire like Cordova prepare, rebuild, reopen it. And whenever you have that fantastic feedback loop, you do a couple of things I think that are really important. One is you try a whole lot more new things. You know, Bart Victor talks about this a lot, but like whenever the feedback loop is really small, you're more likely to experiment, try new things. The cost of discovery is not so high that you don't discover it all. And yeah, live reload. This is super cool. You know, pulling in, what if I want to just look and test a component? Or, you know, make the border radius super, super tiny to the point where it becomes a diamond. You can do these things. And last, the community really is amazing. The community, as an extension of React, continues to be a fantastic community to be in. It's a respectful community evaluating a lot of new ideas, but really respectful of where they are in comparison to other frameworks. It's one of the few communities that I've seen that has such a high emphasis on things like accessibility and software quality, and that really means a lot to me. And you know, people are making apps with this. I know it's sort of a cop-out to use two Facebook examples and get the names wrong, yet alone. But so Facebook uses React Native for their ads manager for Facebook groups. You wouldn't believe it from my shoddy Photoshop work, but the Discord app, Discord is an alternative to Slack. They probably wouldn't appreciate me saying that, but Discord's really cool. So they're using React on their web app, and they're using React Native on their iOS app. And that's a really cool example of like using the same sort of framework to build multiple platforms. So, you know, what does this mean for, I guess, us at Vigit? To talk a little bit more responsibly. When we spec a project, it's interesting because clients are starting to mention React Native as a possibility. And so we're watching it really, really, really closely. And where it's a good fit, in a lot of cases, we find that it is a better fit than something like Cordova, where the client's coming out of the bat wanting a native app, like having a web app persistent to, at the same time as a native app isn't something they're looking for. It's still a really great option, I think, and something we're really excited to use. It's something that I know that will be a part of our array of deliverables in the future. And for those going to South by Southwest, my buddy in Boulder, Lawson, who works in our Boulder office, and we're doing iOS development with React Native workshop in March at South by Southwest. So you should check us out. Thanks. Any questions?
When you did the build there, you were in Xcode, and I guess for Android. Well, I guess my question is, what does it compare to Cordova's kind of one way to build for both platforms? Do you go back to use the native tools for the final packaging, or is there some magic?
Yeah, there is a process. So like I mentioned before, the really nice development error messages and things like that, those do have a penalty on performance. And so there are instructions for doing production builds where you basically disable those things. For me, I don't know if it's changed, but the last time we did a React Native app, we compiled it in Xcode, archived it, sent it out for distribution, just like we would with a native app. I'm not clear if that's the same for Android, but because we have not built a production app on the Android version of iOS native. React Native. It's just not. So at the time, didn't exist, and even now too, we're just watching it really closely because we're not quite convinced that we can do good work in React Native for Android quite yet. That doesn't mean that that's true at all. It's just we don't have experience in it. So does that sort of answer that question?
Yeah, I guess I was just used to. It's sort of, I don't have to learn what's the way that I invoke the Android builder and packager.
Okay, yeah. So there is a CLI. So for Android development, you do React Native, run Android, and it'll boot an emulator for you and open up the app for you. I'm not clear beyond that how you distribute to Android from there.
Is it that for iOS? You just said build the iOS package.
I don't know. That's a good question. So again, we just used Xcode and then used the archive and then worked that way.
So I'm in the Ionic world.
Oh, okay.
Thing. So we use part of our colleagues. They've been doing web development web pages for a while. So porting over Ionic was pretty straightforward. We just built web pages. I have no experience in terms of design of building an app. It was pretty much pretty simple. So I'm curious how the design process works for these types of apps and how that would be shown to clients or users and stuff like that, and then ported to how to develop it. A couple other questions real quick. Code reuse. You showed the two different branches for Android and iOS.
Mm-hmm.
Are those analogous to controller and HTML parts? I don't know, you mentioned Cordova, I don't know if that translates from my app. But is it basically the front end pieces and then you have services behind that? Or do you have a web service integration or something like that? Code reuse?
Yeah. So code reuse. So you're building a JavaScript app still. So you're using React. You're probably building a Flux app. So all your application code, aside from anything that reaches out to access, something on the device itself that might get a little bit murky, but all the application code itself should be pretty much reused. So the whole model behind React that's awesome is that you can have all of your state in like in an application outside of the user interface. You can send those properties into the user interface to render to the screen. And so the neat thing about that then is that you can send that data to more than one place. So I imagine that you share code between all of your data stores, all of your business logic in your JavaScript app. So whenever the more I work with it, the more that I discover working with Android alongside iOS is that they're just entry points into a greater component tree, and I may be sharing components back and forth between them. I know one of the pain points right now is that the iOS switch is a different component than the Android switch. So just having a general wrapper around it, it's easy enough. It's a bit annoying, but it's just React, right? So you check the environment, return a different component, share that code that way. I think the cool thing about it is you can share a lot of the code, and where it makes sense, you can deviate by creating like branches in your component tree to do different things.
And then design, like how does that process work? Like how do you have a mock-up that comes to the developer to make that real and to sort of that mock-up you showcase to your end users and stuff like that? So in other words, like the Ionic world is like pretty much a copy of web development. You can create a static web page, you show that, and then a user can import that into like some basic web framework, Java-based thing, for example.
Right, because it's all just going to a web view. It's opening up on the same platform. Yeah. So you are more married to the platform in that way.
So you have platform-specific designs for this that you work with. Okay, that is.
Yeah, and then so a lot of it is similar, right? Because so you are creating like branded data for the app, and that's consistent. A lot of that's consistent between platforms, and then making things like using the native UI for Android versus iOS helps to distinguish them, but in a way that's pretty well effort. Go ahead.
What's the difficulty of integrating with other pre-existing frameworks? Maybe they're JavaScript, maybe they're not JavaScript, but they have a particular feature that you don't want to take the time to implement.
So, like specifically native?
Maybe something based in D, and it's complicated and it has nice animation. You just want to use it. So is it integrated? And I guess another example is maybe there's something like that maybe is available via NPM has to be compiled. Is it possible that even integrate with those things?
Yeah. So let's just start with Python thing. So like downloading and installing NPM packages that have like a build step beforehand, like using Node.js or something like that. I do not believe that that's possible because the code is being so if it's like a development tool that's not entering into the JavaScript environment for the app, that's totally fair game. But basically, this is something being executed by like a JavaScript engine. The JavaScript engine has to be able to parse the code. So I don't believe that. So if you were to create something like an Objective-C extension and create an interface between it with React Native, that's totally possible. And there's documentation on the website for doing that, for like using the library and interfacing it with React Native, using JavaScript as an interface. As for D3, so the only problem with D3 would be all of the areas where it accesses the DOM, so like the selector engine and the manipulation engine. But all of the calculations for layouts and everything else for doing the force-directed graphs, that's all just math. That thank goodness I don't have to figure out. So like the tree example in my demo, that's sort of using a similar technique. And I've done that in the past with React, where I've used D3 for the layout engine to calculate where everything needs to be, taking those values and using React to render the DOM for it instead of D3. So that's totally on the table as well.
before in your example, you were talking about refs in the context of the native app, and I was wondering what's the use case for accessing a ref in native? Usually when I'm doing accessing a ref in React DOM, I'm using it to access the DOM.
Yeah, in a very similar way. So the view itself has an API on it. So the Navigator is a really good example of that. So the Navigator iOS component that I used has its own API with methods that you might want to call to tell it, pop or push. So the ref is allowing you to access that as like the element underlying it, just like with React. React component may sit in front of a div that you need to get the clipping path for. Sort of a similar thing. There are APIs on that component that you need that you can access really quickly with refs.
I don't know how much you're gonna have worked with it, but if you got any more details about actually writing native components interface with, like my understanding. Sorry, I don't know very well. So writing like an iOS component that has like React on it, what does that look like? Is that an easy use case, or is that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting use case because especially when we did it. So we did it for an app with an iOS app where you're controlling lights that go around the track. And we need to connect to hardware to be able to do it, and React Native didn't support that. So we pulled in the Objective-C library that the hardware manufacturer made, pulled that in, created the interface between it and the standard interface for writing extensions for React Native. And so basically the way that works is you expose it as a native component, and you require it in, and it has a defined API on the JavaScript module that you require that's set by that plugin. And so there's actually now, there's documentation on how that whole works. But basically you just create an Objective-C interface for it, and I imagine it's similar to Java as well. Sort of like whenever, like in Cordova, writing a plugin for it that has a JavaScript API that exposes to the web view, sort of similar.
I'm not like devil's advocate. You think maybe a case for this framework being powerful for a web app developer to create a native iOS app that of look and feel with native iOS app. What would you tell someone who is a native iOS developer? Is there a case to be made to give this a try? And how far away are we from the cross-platform development with React Native? It seems like the Android is not quite there yet, and that would be a win. I think the code that you showed is actually pretty easy if you're an iOS developer. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, so the Android version of React Native does have some differences that do lean more on the JavaScript end more than the iOS end. So the iOS end is very, like with Navigator iOS, that's very like intimately related to the way iOS views work, or pushing and popping anyway. Android's got fragments and a couple other things. It's a different model. I think if you're writing native apps, keep writing native apps. I think it's worth looking at, talking to some friends and reading online, people that have a long experience with iOS. There are a couple of things that hit home that they talk about really liking. I think that's more related to React's model of breaking things down into declarative components and having really clear inputs and outputs to your view logic. And then the whole idea of running like the UI on a separate thread. And then that shows up also in like libraries that Facebook has. Like they've got a library for iOS for doing a similar thing to the components in React. I think where it really becomes valuable is whenever you have a wide range of team members and you want something where the presentation logic can be done in a generally accessible way to every member of your team. If you have native developers, that's even greater. You know, pull them in and lean on their experience for writing extensions to it, and you know, but keep like React Native very focused on the UI portion of it, and use JavaScript as a way to allow more team members to work on your project in parallel.
That's a good answer. One thing I didn't quite understand from what you were saying before is the data storage and some of the backend stuff. That's what would you keep that in native code, or are you also doing that with in the JavaScript layer?
Yeah. So the HTTP interface for React Native is an implementation of the Fetch API, which is a new Ajax API. That's like a working draft. I think it's actually a lot further along than a working draft, but it's basically a more modernized version of XHR that uses promises and some other things. So that's an abstraction they're using. So like I think the neat thing about native is you have answers for durable storage for keeping track of things like caching, like images and things like that. So we wrote a Cordova app, and one of the great things that we could do was download all of this information about 200 megabytes worth of images for animals that we needed from a server, keeping track of all of that. And we could do that really, we didn't answer for that, or we didn't necessarily have in the browser. Similarly, I imagine you're doing a similar thing. The use cases I'm seeing mostly for React Native right now are native apps interfacing with an API, fetching down data, keeping most of it in memory if they need to save it using like a cache for working offline. They'll save it using native mechanisms for that. But it's been pretty lightweight from what I've seen.
Yes. Have you heard of NativeScript?
Yes. Sort
I'm
of.
wondering how does that fit into that ecosystem?
Yeah, I've only heard of it briefly. I've been meaning to dig into it. I just haven't. But the idea is basically like
it's basically saying you write JavaScript in it.
Writes UI code, native UI code. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll be talking about that next time, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, I'll have to check it out. Cool.
Are there any like intricacies specifically related to React and the CI stage that you dealt with, or is there anything special about React Native when it gets to continuous integration?
Yeah. So the way that we tested our React Native apps, so we tested obviously the JavaScript aspects of it are really simple. Doing like end-to-end testing was not something that we had solved yet. We're looking at a couple of things. One, just using existing tools for iOS and Android as like top level like smokescreen tests for end-to-end testing. For CI though, we kept everything inside of the JavaScript layer and used things like shallow rendering of components, so they're not. So the idea of the component is rendered, but not the end state. So we can test the state of the component and make sure that props and state are operating the way that we expect, and then just trust React Native is rendering to the screen properly. So keeping all of your testing inside of JavaScript, and then yeah, we're still trying to figure out the end-to-end testing part too.
It's just pretty well for like studying out the native components.
So I don't know about Jest, because Jest is going to use React DOM, unless you don't touch, not React DOM, sorry, JS DOM, unless you don't touch those parts. We're just testing, honestly, with Mocha and Karma. Karma for DOM testing, so it's or browser testing, which is different, but Mocha is getting us really far. Just testing JavaScript apps purely on the JavaScript aspects of it, and then just using either Node or any other test runner for that. Okay, well, yeah, sorry, I'll let you guys go. Thanks for coming.
How's it going? I'm Andrew.
Hey,